we'll continue the discussion for a while longer.
Thank you. You sit
Thank you.
down.
Thanks to Sara, we do have this room until 3:30. 3:30. So, but we don't have to continue till 3:30. But if you have questions, then let's move to them. We've been to the centre. Let's go back to anybody on this side of the room who'd like to come in. No? Anyone on this side of the room with a question or comment? We've heard from you, so we'll come back to you if nobody else, because I'm very happy to do that. Anybody else who's not been heard so far? Gentleman there.
Hello, my name is John Bennett. I'm currently leading an evaluation of peace building in southern Sudan. I'm interested to pursue a question that perhaps wasn't quite answered enough a bit earlier on, which is the question of what happens after the elections if, in terms of what will happen towards the referendum. In other words, will the outcome of the elections influence the smooth proceeding towards the referendum or not? And what are the dangers? What are the pitfalls that might happen as a result of the elections that might, in turn, undermine the effective smooth transition towards a referendum next January?
Well, certainly I'll invite colleagues to come in on that. One of the things that certainly concerned me during the hearings was this figure that the ministers repeated today about only 10% of IDPs, for instance, being registered. The point Sara was making about the actual process of voting, certainly if in a British election, my former constituents in Liverpool have been confronted with a ballot paper with 12 different questions on it, I think they would have been pretty perplexed. So the legitimacy, therefore, of the election and its outcome could very much play into what happens next year. There was one other addition from a question that I pursued during the proceedings, and that was the issue of registration. But if there really are 2 million Southerners in the north who will not be registered because it would require them to go to the south to register, if that really is so, then obviously those folk will not have votes when it comes to the election. How are they going to feel about being unable to participate in a crucial decision about their own future? So the danger of not so much irregularities, but discontent as a consequence of the election, of people feeling disenfranchised and unable to vote, that could certainly play into events in 2011 if it isn't resolved. But Sara, you're the expert.
Yeah, I think John is alluding to what Simon asked specifically as well. The CPA guarantees that the referendum has to be executed whatever the majority that comes out of the elections is. So a different majority in Parliament doesn't actually have the legitimacy to revoke the referendum. However, discussions in Sudan take place on all sorts of issues, and you know how parties may reach agreements. It's very clear in the minds of Sudanese that the referendum is a landmark of the CPA that's going to be very difficult to change. The main problem is the potential political confusion that may arise from the elections, and what happens if that confusion is not well managed and addressed, and how that can impinge on a process that will lead to a referendum vote being allowed to be exercised without difficulties, as well as all the political discussions that need to take place around the outstanding issues that need to be addressed before people go to vote for the referendum.
John, it's nice to see you again, because I know you've got a lot of experience, and I think you'll probably know all the answers. But apart from the legitimacy point that's already been made about the elections, I just say personally, I felt there was a precipice when I first saw the term post-referendum. I thought, this is like that, you fall off the edge. But the more I've been thinking about it, and the more I know that people are working on it, I realize that it isn't the end, because it is the concentration of the mind that really matters. When you vote for secession, you don't actually break off. You have to think very hard about what happens next. The question is, how much can you do that in advance?
Jenny.
Well, I haven't got very much to say about this, really, but because I am still very worried and very concerned about the elections. We heard that there was huge enthusiasm in Juba for the election, a lot of electioneering going on. But there are people in the rest of southern Sudan. In fact, the majority are in the rest of southern Sudan. David mentioned the displaced people in the north. And I suppose what worries me most of all about the forthcoming elections, let alone the referendum, is what challenges there will be afterwards against the result. Because unless that monitoring, which the Minister talked about, is absolutely blanket coverage of southern Sudan, I'm very concerned that there will be challenges to the result and people will say it wasn't properly monitored.
Thank you. Caroline.
Well, very briefly, my colleagues have covered the general issues, but I would just come back to real concerns for the marginalised areas. As I mentioned, I was in southern Kordofan, but I think the same would probably apply in Blue Nile, and Abyei is in a slightly different category now. But there is a real fear there. First of all, as I was in southern Kordofan, all the opposition candidates, the day before I was there, had suddenly pulled out of the election process because they said they had two concerns: the huge discrepancy between the census and the numbers registering, but also the changing constituencies that they felt had been changed away from the favour of the SPLM in the direction of the NCP, and they were boycotting. They were going to Khartoum. I haven't heard the outcome, and if they've since come back into agreement to participate, but it's symptomatic of the deep, deep concerns felt in the marginalised areas. And just looking ahead to the referendum, the very real fears they expressed in southern Kordofan, but they said similarly in Blue Nile, and I think maybe the Beja people in the east are also worried in a rather different way, but they're marginalised. But they feel very strongly that if the South chooses to go for independence and secession, they will be much more vulnerable. They've been offered a consultation in some of those areas, but there's no substance to consultation as yet at all identified. They feel that is just an empty promise, and they feel very vulnerable to possible domination by the North. And those who are Africans expressed again and again their concern about the protection of their African culture, their African identity, their African heritage. And so there's a lot of fear in the marginalised areas, and one or two of their leading people actually said, well, for us, if the South secedes, our only way forward to protect our heritage may be to revert to war. Now, nobody wants war, but they feel there's a lot of confidence building needed, shall I say, for the marginalised areas. A lot of substance needs to be given to them as to what their options might be for the future.
In the report itself appears this sentence on page 32: flawed elections command limited legitimacy, and observers and international sponsors of the CPA may face difficult decisions around positioning following the results. So I think your question, in a sense, is certainly implicitly answered by what we stated there. Do you want to come back?
Just a very quick technical question. This is my own ignorance. I apologise. And the question is simply: are those registered for elections the same? Will that registration also be the same registration for the referendum? In other words, those excluded people from elections presumably will also be excluded from being registered for referendum.
Well, in fact, I might invite His Excellency the Ambassador to respond to that question, because we found some confusion about that very point, John, and did raise it ourselves regularly. And again, you'll see in the report we say this matter was not clarified, indicating a degree of confusion around this important matter. So His Excellency might be able to give us more up to the moment advice on this. Not official, but yes, and maybe we'll hear from the South on the same.
It's very clear from the agreement that those who are eligible to vote for the referendum are the southern Sudanese nationals, be them in the north, in the south, or abroad. So I think whoever proves to be from the south is eligible for voting. That's it.
Where do they have to register, though, I think is part of the question, isn't it? Do they have to go back to the south to do that?
I have to clear that. I don't know.
This still remains the issue. Maybe we ask our friends from the south, would they like to say a word on that, because it's an interesting discussion.
Well, in fact, that remains a very grey area, really, as far as the self-determination for Southern Sudan is concerned. But I must say that at one point in time, when I met a very reliable person in Southern Sudan, he has assured me that the registration which is being done now is also going to be done for the self-determination of Southern Sudan. And he has expressed fear that during this registration, especially overseas, many people belonging to Southern Sudan have been deprived from going for the registration because there were some certain things which were required from them, things like birth certificate and nationality, which they've lost. You remember, most of the people, especially in this country, came through East Africa as kind of refugees. So these documents, like the nationality and so forth, were not with them. So they've been under-registered. And now that if this registration is going to be done for the self-determination for Southern Sudan, it leaves a lot to be desired because they are under-registered. But I think the Commission for the Self-Determination of Southern Sudan will have a say over this when it is full.
Thank you, Dr. Offel. Okay, now let's move on. There's a hand up at the back here. And someone over here as well. We'll go to you next.
About the answer of the ambassador, anyone who will prove that he's from South Sudan. Actually, during the registration for the elections, there was huge different variation in the views about how to prove you are Sudanese. And even when we went here to the Sudanese embassy to register, more people were turned down because of the requested documents, which was accepted today, it was not accepted the following day. Which was accepted for somebody, it was declined for other. This about to prove you are a Sudanese, which is very specific. It is a birth certificates, passport or something. How can you think about to prove you are Sudanese and from South Sudan? Is it? I think there is no way to have registration given the current circumstances and the people who are dealing with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over here at the back. Could you give your name and who you are, please?
Thank you. Adrian Hewitt from ODI. And perhaps I should declare an interest in the sense that we've got 6 ODI fellows working for the government of Southern Sudan in Juba at the moment, plus one sitting in front of me, so that makes 7. And I wanted to ask the Minister the question about secession, but I missed the beginning of the meeting and I fear she must have missed the end, so I'm sorry about that. So I'll put my question to the panel, if I may. Obviously, there are lots of pitfalls in holding elections and conducting a referendum. If these become so serious that the government of Southern Sudan feels obliged to declare UDI to secede. What does the panel think will be the reaction of the African Union, apart from being split down the middle? Will they recognize a new state? And really, I wanted to ask the same question to a government minister, because it was a question that confronted Harold Wilson in the 60s, and it might confront the next Prime Minister in the 10s.
Well, I think we are rather jumping ahead of ourselves if we're not careful here. The African Union are sending a very high-level delegation, which we mention again in the report, who have been involved in drawing up the electoral code and conduct of the declaration, and they intend to have a very high-level delegation monitoring the elections. I think that we must assume, as the Minister did say actually in her remarks earlier on, that this wouldn't be a perfect process, but it is the only process that's about at the moment, and that she remained optimistic that it could deliver results that would be accepted on all sides. And hearing, as we have done today, from representatives from the North and the South, there clearly is a willingness to try and make this work. But I invite colleagues, if they want to respond to this, but I think we should be very careful of hypothecating about situations that haven't arisen yet and trying to put people into positions which we hope will never arise. But, John, does anybody want to?
I think it would be inappropriate to speak for the African Union. And it's not our place to do so.
Fortunately, we don't speak either for the African Union or the British government in this case. So having evaded that one, where do we move to next? The gentleman there.
My name's Tom Carter. Thank you. My name's Tom Carter. I wasn't in Juba 2 weeks ago, but I was there in 1978 to 80 when I lived and worked there, working for the Southern Regional Governments, and then I've been working there off and on since 2005, including a spell as an advisor in GOS, in the Ministry of Urban Development and Housing. Without in any way wishing to minimise the whole issue of the election, I think that the CPA stands or falls on much more than that, and particularly one of the elements which I understand, I haven't seen the final report, but I understand is part of it, is the whole developmental issue. And that's the one that I've been particularly involved with, most recently in Abyei and Kurmuk in Blue Nile State. And while obviously a lot of these issues are underpinned by uncertainty, there is also a huge importance, which I want to stress and would like to be interested to hear the committee's views about how we all, and particularly the British government, can accelerate the basic delivery of basic services. And I draw attention to a report which is at the risk of being sort of forgotten about, but that came out earlier this year, in January, Rescuing the Peace in Southern Sudan, which actually very clearly makes the point that one of the three major elements that's got to happen is the whole issue of development. In parallel, I would just say I've been invited by DFID, so there are people working there on how they can better do it, address this issue. But there is a concern that a lot of the British government, the DFID involvement is rather what I would call, the UN rather likes as the preamble. It's sort of analysis, reviews of doing investigations rather than actually helping deliver in practical terms the improved services that I believe are absolutely critical throughout the whole of Sudan, not just in the south and not just in the north.
Well, I'll certainly ask colleagues to comment on that. We did take a lot of evidence about the humanitarian issues, development questions. But one of the things that struck us, I think, forcefully was that unless you deal with security and justice issues and deal with conflict, then development can't follow. It's compromising development, and indeed resources being wasted as a result of the destruction of projects which were created through development programs, which then are laid waste as a result of conflict. So the link between those two things is very considerable indeed. And the continued flow of arms into the region is one of the things that caused us a lot of concern, not least because, yes, Ukrainian companies and so on have been involved in this, but third-party British brokers have been involved. So these things are close to home. Capacity building, I think, was the other thing, which we touch on page 36 of the report, which I'd draw your attention to, that clearly we looked at things like the lack of roads in the south of the country and the inability, therefore, to bring development to the country unless you have some fundamental capacity and infrastructure. John, you're the expert really on this, though.
Well, I'm in sympathy with the questioner. That's my difficulty, because I come from an NGO background. I've been to too many places where governments are invisible, basically. They are the NGOs that you see on the ground working with people who are doing the work. And I'm afraid that the charges have been levelled. We couldn't repeat them in a report like this because you need a lot of circumstantial evidence as well. The charges are levelled that money which has been given to Southern Sudan for its oil resources is actually not coming through to the rural areas sufficiently, and too much is being taken up in the structure of government. There will be people who are going off with money on their own, and that is what happens in a very poor society. It's sometimes inevitable when you have poverty that people will take shortcuts. But we don't have that evidence, and I think David is right that the conditions are the ones that are most important in the next 12 months, especially for development to go ahead. I've got a godson who sends me emails from Juba, and that's, I'm afraid, my only way of keeping in touch because it's a long time since I went there myself.
Thanks, John. Sara next, and then we'll bring in Jenny and Caroline.
I was there mainly being part of the evaluation that John is leading, that is really looking at multi-donor assistance to Southern Sudan over the last 5 years, in particular its contribution to conflict prevention and peace building. And what you say, Tom, is very true, and there is a lot of evidence of the difficulties that many of the funding arrangements in Southern Sudan have had. John, you're right when you emphasize some of the difficulties in tracking where some of the government of Southern Sudan oil revenues have gone and how they've been spent. But it's also true that there has been an assumption in the assistance that's been planned and delivered in Southern Sudan, that we were helping Southern Sudan go back to something. You know, it was a sort of reintegration, recovery, reconstruct, a lot of in a region that actually really had very little infrastructure, very little institutions to start with. And so the assumptions on which the delivery of these funds was predicated was essentially flawed. And it was very difficult for something like the multi-donor trust fund that really was supposed to be underpinned by strong government capacity to deliver around these things, could deliver so quickly. I have to say, though, I've been encouraged to see that something is moving, also in terms of the MDTF. I mean, it's taken the government of Southern Sudan and international partners, 5 years to kind of start making it work. But finally, procurement procedures have been eased by the World Bank. In the various technical ministries, more capacity has been built along the way to deal with some of these procedures. It's taken a long time to make it work, but it's starting very slowly to work. And there is, of course, great complementarity with other funds, like the Basic Services Fund, which tries to address service delivery more directly. But what you were saying is the most important thing that comes out of the work that we're doing with this evaluation, which is that actually there is still this understanding of peace dividends in international circles as basic services, whereas the communities very strongly emphasize that their view of peace dividends is security, is their physical security. And there has been very little investment, very little direction of assistance in the areas of security and justice that have been deprioritized compared to others.
Thank you, Sara. Jenny.
Well, I just want to say, really, and I feel very passionately about this, I often wonder what people from the Sudan, particularly in the government, from the north and the south here, think, having to sit and listen to us pontificate about their country. I mean, it is your country, and it's up to you what happens to your country. But I do feel quite passionately, and I want to get this over to you, there has not been enough development in southern Sudan for people to see any peace dividend whatsoever. It just hasn't happened. Now, in our report we discovered, I don't know how accurate the figure is, but 90% of the income of southern Sudan comes from the oil revenues. I think that was a fairly reliable figure. If that is so, it would be good if the people of southern Sudan knew where that money had gone and exactly what the breakdown was, and why it hasn't been spent on health systems, health infrastructure, roads, education, all of those things that the people thought they were going to get when the peace agreement was signed. And I just finish by saying, I don't want to interfere, I don't want to patronise. I think colonial times are over, but it is in the interests of everybody in the north and the south and the east and the west of Sudan to realise that the people have got to have a better life. Otherwise, there will be civil war everywhere. And it's just in your interest to ensure that that happens.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. Those figures that Baroness Tong was referring to are on page 16 of the report. Yeah. Lady Cox.
Well, just briefly, I couldn't agree more strongly with the question. It's very hard to keep democracy on an empty stomach. In my own small NGO heart, we do go out to the remote areas. We go up to Bahr el-Ghazal, we go all over Eastern Upper Nile, and we discover situations that should not be present in the world today. We see leprosy. We find leprosy in Eastern Upper Nile. We find the kind of conditions which are mentioned in the report, which I mentioned in my other remarks, so I won't repeat them. But one of my concerns is the distribution of the funds that have been made available. I've raised this issue with my colleagues in the House of Lords about the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, some of the worst health statistics in the world today. And DFID is giving very generously. So one of the questions to try to be practical, which I've asked Her Majesty's government, is if DFID would undertake an assessment and evaluation of where its aid is going. It seems to me, and this perhaps comes up with an issue already mentioned by my colleagues, partly related to security. I think some of the major programs, the major aid organizations, tend to be in areas which are relatively secure, and to be realistic, there's a relatively quick exit. And one way forward, perhaps from that, might be the kind of policy which my small NGO operates with, which we work with local partners who don't put foreign teams on the ground, who identify local people who are working so hard to make a difference for their own people, who give them a helping hand. And so in Bara Ghazal, we're helping with schools, education, teacher training, but not putting foreign teams on the ground, working with local people who are already working themselves so hard to help their own people. And they multiply the little we give them in ways beyond anything you can imagine. Other areas in southern Kordofan, in the mountains, we're working to help widows develop widows' collectives. Life is tough for widows anywhere, post-conflict situation, tough. But widows' collectives, the women themselves get together. We help with the centres. They get together. They have their enterprises. They make jams and matting. They get financially independent, psychosocial support. That also gives hope. In other areas, we help with orphans. There's so many orphans. Normally in Africa, you shouldn't have abandoned orphans. But with the LRA, with other people, parents already died from war or from HIV/AIDS. We always ask local people their priorities, help them to meet their own needs according to their definition, gives them the dignity of choice. And I perhaps would like to see some of the aid paradigm shift from the large aid organisations, which will only and can only operate in the secure areas because they have responsibility for their own staff, to going out into the remote areas and helping local people make a difference to their own people. And I think that would be just one way forward which I would really recommend. And the other aspect, which is a side issue, but a very important one, the problem of returnees. Returnees come back from the north and they go to their areas and there's no school, there's no health provision. How can they stay? There's nothing to enable them to have a viable life for them and their families. So that again raises the priority to try to reach the unreached parts, and that might do something to help these appalling statistics, which actually are a shame for Sudan. And my heart goes out to the Sudanese people. It's not your fault, but I think the international community needs to be realistic in helping the dissemination of the resources that are desperately needed.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Tom, for the question. I think that brings us now to the end. We have
Can I
reached
just say
3:30,
one
but
thing
I would
before
never
we
dream
go?
of trying to stop Jenny from saying one
I,
thing.
it has just caught my eye, and maternal health is one of my things, because that was my profession before I came into Parliament. 1 in 7 women who become pregnant will die in pregnancy or of related complications of childbirth. If that was 1 in 7 men, gentlemen, you would have done something about it. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. And you'll notice elsewhere in the report that one of the things that we do suggest is that the role of women in Sudan, both in the north and south, should be enhanced, not least through the election process. And I would make the general observation as a man on the panel that the contribution of women to political and public life is something we could not do without in this country.
Yeah,
and
but
I
you've
think
never had a baby yet.
No, but my wife has. And so
It doesn't count. It doesn't count.
And so I do feel quite strongly as well, like you, about some of the statistics you mentioned.
They can stay afterwards for
we can stay afterwards, and there will be an opportunity to come and have those discussions now. But I did say we would be ending at 3:30. We have to conclude now. We're also going offline. And so can I thank everybody who has tuned in and watched and taken part in the discussion from all the places around the world where they may have been viewing the proceedings today. And I thank all of you who participated in the discussion, but particularly those of you who came and gave of your own time very generously to the proceedings that we held, everyone who's contributed to the oral and the written evidence. And as far as the motivation is concerned, I think I can underline a point that Jenny was making just before. This report is, if you like, an act of love. That's because of our love for the people of Sudan in the north and the south. We want to see the comprehensive peace agreement work, become enduring. We want stability, and we want political progress and development. And we also want to be in a position in due course where you can come and give us some advice about some of the things that we know need sorting out in our own society. But it's not a patronising report in any sense. It is offered as a gift of love, and we hope that it will bear many fruits. Thank you for being here today.